Moshe, 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 come to me. Elohe, Eloheinu, Elohe, Abraham, Elohe, Yitzhak, Elohe, Yaakov.
Good day and shalom to another exciting edition of Torah Watchman show, presented by your host, Reb Yair ben-Emmett. This is a continuation of the documentary that I started recently. This is a continuation of part one for an introduction to Karaite Judaism, namely the ancient history of the Karaite people, something that is commonly dismissed by Rabbanites. The word Rabbanites is an adversarial term that was created by the Karaite people under oppression by the elitists, rabbis of the Middle Ages, from the 8th century through 15th century, who pretty much made themselves kings and elitist governors over their provinces of control throughout Europe. So let's get started. If you remember, I mentioned an individual by Anan, and this name is actually a prefix for the word Anites. It's actually named after an individual that is confused. Today, many people say Anites are the same thing as Karaites. That's not necessarily true, but both of these organizations, Jewish organizations, had problems with the Rabbanites or Rabbinical Judaism of their time. Of course, Orthodox Judaism as we coin it today is a little more than 100 years of age, okay, back in the 1800s. So the so-called Rabbinical Judaism is something that you describe a group of rabbis or reaching a quorum, coming together over decades of time, and then codifying the Talmud, the oral tradition of Mishnah Torah, to something that is almost polarly opposite of what the halakha is in the Torah and the Tanakh and the prophets of blessed memory. Many Orthodox rabbis will refute what I just said. They say that oral tradition came from Mount Sinai. I said in the last video, oral tradition did not come from Mount Sinai. Any oral tradition that came from Mount Sinai was from word of mouth by Moshe taught to the Jewish people, but the original data source was not even Moshe. It was God, Jehovah God himself, enthroned on Mount Sinai during that time. So let's get started. The first group of Karaites referred to rabbinic polemics against Anan. In other words, Anites strictly followed the teachings of Anan ben Dawid, a very ascetic sect. They were isolated among others. They were actually quite similar to many aspects to the Rabbanites. Anan was quite heavily influenced by the Rabbanism and was criticized for this later by Karaite commentaries because he essentially supported positions both within Karaite Jewish sectors and communities and the Rabbanites. He tried to bridge these two together, okay? So the Anites were only one of the most prominent of the early schismatic groups. There's their word again. It was not until several generations after Anan that the Karaites were widely recognized as a formal Jewish movement. So you could say maybe that Anan or the Anites was the trigger that started or spawned the modern or contemporary Karaite movement. Okay? Now let's skip to the golden age of Karaite Judaism. For a good period of time, there was a relatively harmony between the Rabbanites and Karaites. Granted, the Karaites were not approved of by the Rabbinate overlords. However, the Rabbinate authorities were generally not concerned about them. Okay? They considered them as noise and as a minority group opinion of Judaism. The Karaites were perceived as nothing more than ineffectual pockets of dissent, and the Rabbinites believed that they would soon disappear on their own if left to themselves. This sounds like what Rabbi Gamaliel said in the time of Jesus and 2,000 years ago. Leave the Christians alone; they'll disappear if left to themselves. Very similar paradigm there between the two. Sorry for the tangent. All of this changed in the 9th and 10th centuries, especially when Sa'adiah al-Fayoumi, an influential rabbi from Egypt, became the head of the Babylonian Jewish community. Sa'adiah was a very strong-willed man. He tolerated no resistance to his rule. In his mind, sufferance of any dissension was tantamount to approval. So in a series of polemic tracts, Sa'adiah systematically attacked Karaite practice and theology. You heard me right. These are Jews attacking Jews. Sometimes, we talk about anti-Semitism. Sometimes our fellow Jew is our worst enemy. That is the insider threat. One way of looking at that. So falsely accusing Anan and the Karaites of nefarious intent and action, the wake of the attack of the Sa'adiah on Karaite Judaism caused a drastic change in the nature and construction of Karaite communities. Prior to the ascension of Sa'adiah, Karaites and Rabbanites lived more or less side by side. In other words, they did not have to live in separate communities in order to get along. This was the end, okay? So prior to Sa'adiah, the Karaites had been little more than a confederation of like-minded schismatics. Now that they bonded together in self-defense. For example, in the 9th century, Daniel L. Kumizi wrote, and I'll give you a small excerpt of this, "You will have no valid excuse before God if you do not return to the law of God and to his ordinances as prescribed it, because since the beginning of the exile, in the days of the kingdom of the Greeks and Romans and Magans, the Rabbinites held the offices of princes and judges, and those saw the law could not even open their mouths in behalf of the ordinances of God for fear of Rabbinites who were ruling over them. Upon the arrival of the kingdom of Ishmael," you're talking about Islamic Muslims, the dawn of Islam. However, matters improved, for the Ishmaelites always helped the Karaites to observe the true faith as set forth in the law of Moshe, and we bless him for it. Very interesting. The Karaite sect of Judaism actually got along to their fellow cousins, the Islamic peoples of Arabia, and the other, like Asia Minor and other places, in Israel, Syria, and even Egypt. They got along with them because they had more in common. Believe it or not, Karaite had more in common with Islam at that time than rabbinical Judaism. Continuing on, the period of travail of Karaite Judaism gave birth to a rise in quality Karaite scholarship, an increase in the literary output of its leaders. The literacy rate increased and scholarship in academia. Instead of stamping out Karaite Judaism as the plans of the Rabbinites had hoped, their polemics served to seal and solidify Karaite Judaism as a formal organized movement. In other words, they established standard good practices, policies. They were not all over the place in their definition of terms. They had agreements with halakha as defined within the Torah. They had group consensus, and they decided those people that were splinter groups, they decided to either let them go or bring them together in some sort of shalom or harmony. They knew that they would be stronger working together than working against each other in order to deal with the new enthroned kings of rabbis that had pronounced that the Karaites were essentially a non-Jewish issue for them. The golden age of Karaite Judaism lasted from the 10th century through the 12th century. It is much of the works of the great Karaite luminaries. I'll mention a few of them. Yaakov al-Kazani, Yofet ben Lewi, Saul ben Masilah, Yosef al-Basir, Yeshua ben Yehuda, Salmon ben Yoram, and there are many others that they produced. These are great intellectuals of their time. To say that the Karaite sect of Judaism does not have sages is a misnomer. It's wrong. We have our own rabbis of blessed memory as well. These people were extremely literate in halakha and legal codes. They wrote commentaries, grammars, there's how to pronounce Hebrew, the lexicons, translations, poetry. Some of these are still widely respected and relied upon today as part of the culture statement of Karaite Jews. Their works were filled with discourses on science, philosophy, medicine, world religion, and other topics that display their vast knowledge of erudition. Okay? So moving forward, Karaites from Byzantium, Spain, North Africa, Iraq, Persia, and other regions of the exile traveled to Jerusalem and studied with Avalé Sayan. When they returned, these students brought back with them commentaries, legal codes, and translations that they had acquired. In this way, the learning of the academies were disseminated to the community as a whole. What follows is a brief introduction to some of the most formidable minds of this period, and I want to include some of these names in the works, namely Yaakov al-Kazani, I mentioned these individuals before, Yofet ben Halevi, and finally Saul ben Masilah. Yaakov, for instance, is often regarded as one of the greatest minds of Karaite Judaism, medieval or otherwise. In the course of his lifetime, he produced at least 10 works of which we are aware. He wrote an exhaustive legal code, commentaries, philosophical works, and polemics, as well as works on philosophy, interpretive methodology, grammar, the nature of witchcraft, medicine, dream interpretation, psychology, natural science, etc., etc. Amazing, right? It sounds a little bit of the inner workings of the mind of the Rabban. Kokasani's most famous works are known as the Kadabu, Rayad, Wal Hada'ik. Apologize, my Arabic is kind of weak here, which is essentially known as the Book of Gardens and Parks, a commentary on the non-legal portions of the Torah, and the Kadabu Le'anwar wa Le'marakib, the Book of Lights and Watchtowers, a schematic code of the law. Some of these books on sale today are thousands of dollars in cost. They're in museums throughout Europe. Now, getting to Yofet ben Halevi, he was a native of Basra, and Iraq, is considered the most foremost commentator of the golden age of Karaite Judaism. These are our founding fathers, folks. He lived in the last half of the 10th century through the first part of the 11th century. Like Kazani, he wrote only in the Judeo-Arabic form. Yofet ben Eli's commentaries cover the breadth of Scripture, Torah, Levim, which are prophets, Ketuvim, the sacred writings, and other commentary is presented with his own translation of biblical text. Occasionally, Yofet ben Eli includes in his commentaries information about the grammar, history, law, and polemics against the Rabbanites. In other words, describing their differences, their commonalities, things they agreed on, and things they were diametrically opposed on. Many of the criticisms by rabbinical Judaism and Orthodox rabbis today against the Karaites, they said that they ignore oral tradition, so they ended up having to create their own tradition. Listen, they were talking about their culture. These Karaite Jews were all over the world, literally. Not in just the Middle East and Levant, they were all over the world. For instance, Karaite Jews in Egypt had a different cultural statement and a way of looking at life philosophically on how the Torah was applied to their existence compared to Iraq, compared to Syria, compared to people living in Israel and elsewhere in Northern Africa. These are cultural things that as far as what people wore, people dress, how they dated holidays across the year, other things like this. And the same can be said about Ashkenazim and Sephardim because we are different between each other, the way we do Passover Seder meals, the way we do other holidays as well. Okay, so to each their own, right? Though Yafet was a formidable scholar, his commentaries are not necessarily the product of original thought. His genius comes in the synthesis of his learning and his application. He drew heavily upon the Rabbinate and Karaite scholars. Support him. Did he commit plagiarism? Possibly, but there were many individuals that were geniuses in their own time and did produce many products from original thought. Now, the next section here is Karaite Judaism and the Byzantium. The Karaites from Byzantium who came to the Jerusalem academies to study transcribed, translated, and summarized the teaching of Jerusalem masters into Hebrew for the communities at home who spoke Judo-Greek. Now, this is very important when I say translation. What we're talking about is that when your native tongue in Egypt is Egyptian, and many people say Egyptians are the same as Saudi Arabia. It's not true. They're not Arab. They're Egyptian. They have different language. They have different dialects. Even from the north and south areas there, they spoke different dialects. It's very important to be able to translate their dialect into a common form of language like Judo-Greek. During this time, many people spoke Greek as well during this time. You hear about the Septuagint and things like that among Christians. Well, there were a mixed bag of languages that were evolving, adapting, and changing and morphing throughout the entire time between the 8th and 15th century. And then you started Anglo-Saxon and all this stuff. Okay? So, moving forward, I want to mention here, during this period as well, a strong Rabbinite influence began to make itself on Karaism. Yes, we were impacted by the thinking of Rabbanites. The writings of Abraham ibn Ezra and Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, had a profound impact on the Jewish communities of the Mediterranean. They lived in the same areas, geographically speaking, okay? And the Karaites were not exempt from their sway. I mean, of course you could be influenced because you had people living in the communities, maybe across a border fence or something, and you talk to people at the pub and other areas like this, or maybe visitors to a synagogue. They shared ideas, okay? So I want to point out a philosophical bent in the writings of Ibn Ezra, including Yafet ben Eli Halevi's influence on him, and the rational philosophy of Maimonides attracted many Karaites. So, in other words, I said this before in the last video, Rambam was the most highly regarded rabbi or sage of blessed memory in rabbinical Judaism by far. Okay, they agreed more with what he said as far as halakha is concerned, and the way he provided commentaries and discussions on the Torah than any other rabbi. Okay, and of course this is not the Rabbanites are not immune to this. Of course they took other people's ideas and improved them. This is just human nature, okay? It's not a criticism pointed at anyone. The Karaite Hakam Eliyahu Bashiaki is perhaps the most famous controversial scholar of the Byzantine period. He and his brother-in-law, Caleb Havanidopolo, composed the legal commentary Adaret Eliyahu, which continues to have a deep impact on Quran observance to this day. Bashiaki was also perhaps the scholar most profoundly influenced by Rabbanism. He went to the extent of suggesting Abraham ibn Ezra was a student of Yafet ben Eli, and that when Ibn Ezra attacked the Karaites, it was out of fear that it would be discovered his true sympathies were Karaite. Maybe a Jewish double agent, all kidding aside. Now we're moving to section of the Karaite Jews of Eastern Europe. We're beginning with the reign of Theodosius I, the 398 Common Era. The Karaites from Persia moved to Adrianople, which is modern Iran, Turkey, and the Byzantine Empire, eventually gradually moving from there to Constantinople, which is modern Istanbul, Turkey of today, and also to the Crimean Peninsula. This is known as Crim, Russia today, taken from Ukraine, settling in the city of Sakhat, called presently in Karaite Judo-Tatar Zaki Karim Old Crimea, being that the Crimean Peninsula had recently come under Byzantine control. Very interesting. I just want to have a small segue here. There's a lot of people that are confused about so-called Tatars and Karaites and Crimea. They're not the same people. Only Karaites are Jews. The Tatars are not Jewish, okay? Let's get that out of the way. Under the Byzantine Emperor Constantine V, this is around 742 CE, Khazar Turks from the region of Bukhara invaded the Crim. Karaite writers in the Byzantine and elsewhere deride the Khazars, call them enemies of Israel, and even equate the name Khazar with the Hebrew word Mamzer, as well as the commentaries of Yafet ben Eli Halevi talked about this, and Yehuah ben Yehuda, in this confusing of this word here, Mamzer. At the end of the 11th century Common Era, the Crusader Baldwin I, Count of Edessa, the King of Jerusalem, noble role there, with the aid of Ganassi, transferred 250 Karaite families from Jerusalem to Crim, settling them in the fortress towns of Kal, okay, and Manga. This is around 1200 CE. Now we're going through time. Tatars conquered the interior of Crim. The Ghanese founded the trading colonies on the coast. Many more Byzantine Karaites moved to Crim. This is considered a place of refuge when you had battling of powers, invading armies, on which people had to live, and communities in which you're competing for jobs and skills and products and services. Judo Creek speaking Karaites gradually adopted the language of the Tatars and developed the Karaite Judo Tatar dialect. Very fascinating here. The Tatars esteemed the Karaites so well because they spoke their language. Amazing concept here. Khan appointed a Karaite to the hereditary title of Agha and Mint Master. This position remained until Crimea was conquered by Russia in the 18th century. Many people talking about Ukraine war, choosing sides between Russia and Ukraine as for territory. Who invaded what? Well, I'm just read to you that Russia has literally occupied the area of Crim in the 18th century. Okay, I'm skipping along here. In 1463 Common Era, Turks conquer the Crimean coast, ousting the Ghanese, the Karaites remaining in the fortress towns except in Mongop, where the Tatars settled as well as among them. Later, due to the oppression of the Rabbanites, the Karaites fled Mongop and went to Kal, also known as Kufut Kal, and to Gazlov, Epipetaria. After the Karaites fled Mongop, the Tatars also abandoned it. Sometime after the Karaite community of Luk had grown greatly, another community of 60 families was started in Dazani in Vahania near Luk on the Hori River. Yeah, Luk is a community. That community was, however, destroyed by the Ukrainian Hadamat leader Ganta's army, and the few survivors returned to Luk and Haliz. So, in other words, Karaite shared the wins and the losses, the fortunes, and loss of life and communities and homes. So as when the Tatars became weak, so did the Karaites. Okay. Now the Karaites in Lithuania also spread out and settled in many towns and Pavals in the region of the Penedès. And I don't speak Lithuanian. Salty and Pasalti in the regions of Bazai or Bees, you probably know that word. In all these communities here, like Yubmerge, Korani, in the region of Tarakai, and Swati, Azero, and etc. I'm just defining these communities. These are milestones in the history of Karaite Judaism, growth and life and a common era. The number of Karaite families were transferred by the Polish king of John Sarowski III from Trakai to Kazal in 1688 Common Era. Over 100 years later, the Galicia came under the Australian rule due to the oppression of the local government, and the majority of Karaites abandoned Kazal. Listen, Karaites suffered the same quality of life statement as most in rabbinical Judaism, okay? So you had Orthodox Jews rising and falling in important communities. You had the invading armies of Islamic caliphates, like in Spain, ended a 500-year reign of Jews there, that living in harmony. Of course, in 1492, the Roman Catholic invasion of that area drove Jews out of there as exiled, and etc. and etc. In 1863, the Karaites were given rights equal to those of the native Russian population. Through the 1874 Common Era, the office of the Hakam, we mentioned that word before, Uvpatara, in an effort to relieve the Karaites of some impressive Russian anti-Semitic laws, convinced the Russian government that they were not Jews, but the descendants of Turk Khazars. Now, this was a white lie here, and they're doing this to be able to save their lives, essentially. Because in the middle of anti-Semitism, when Jews were targeted, they were wearing the clothes of Khazars. So they were eating the food of Khazars, they were using the dialect of Khazars, so they could easily dress in costumes, per se, and cloak their real identity for a brief period of time to escape anti-Semitism. You can read about Ramban. He said the same thing. There's rumors that Ramban actually briefly swore an allegiance to Islam and Allah just to be able to save his back. Okay, so I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. I'm saying Jews had to do what they had to do to survive in these tumultuous times. This was only for the external consumption, as I mentioned. Within Karaite community, they continued to identify themselves as Jews. Same thing happened to Jews like in Spain. They lit Shabbos candles privately in their homes, but when they're out in the public, they had to also go to mosque, and they had to worship as Muslims do. Ramban had problems with this, and other rabbis advised it's better to die than to convert over to Islam. This is documented throughout Jewish history, both left and right. Okay? So due to the increasing anti-Semitic laws and actions in order to protect the rights of Karaite community, in 1910 Common Era, the Congress of Hamim and Hazamim decided to no longer allow marriages between Rabbanites and Karaite or accept Rabbanites who wished to become Karaites. This ban was not always followed, and marriages between Rabbanites and Karaites still occurred, but rarely. This was a turning point to the end and made things much, much worse for Karaite. Imagine if you were in a tumultuous marriage, especially a woman subject to domestic abuse, okay? And you actually are married across lines, a theological line, to a rabbinate, for instance. Say your husband is a rabbinate, but you're a Karaite. And say, but you get to a point where you divorce, or it's not even recognized. You have to stay legally married. You cannot move on in your life, even though you've moved to separate areas of the world. This issue was happening. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the communist government accepted the Tsarist opinion that Karaites were a Turkic people descended from the Khazars. This is a lie that was used over a period of time to protect the hides of Karaite Jews, okay? Again, this is for external consumption. As the writer of my research book, and by the way, my research, bulk of it comes from an introduction to Karaite Judaism, the history, theology, practice, and custom, okay? From the Karaite Publishing Center. So in 1940, Common Era, zipping through time, Lithuania was annexed by USSR, and Poland became a Soviet satellite. Communist policies were extended to those countries as well, and the same result occurred as in the USSR. Interestingly, during the same time frame leading up to 1991-92, this is when my wife and entire Muspoka left Sukhumi, Abkhazia, as war refugees to come to America. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a good segue, 1993, Common Era, President Reagan says, Russia, bring down the Berlin Wall. Karaites in the former USSR and Poland began to show renewed interest in their Jewish heritage, some even immigrating to Israel. So when the reigns of control and tyranny and anti-Semitism was minimized, they started really rethinking their life. By this time, Israel was founded in 1948 as an independent nation by unanimous UN resolution. And of course, the success is demonstrated in 1967 war. They said, well, Israel would probably be the safest nation at this time for Karaite brothers and sisters to move to. So they still brought the ancestry with them. When I say ancestry, the ancestral cultural traditions and underpinning, like from Egypt, like from Iraq, like from Syria, like from Algeria, from elsewhere in the world. They brought all of their cultural traditions to Israel with them. If you go to Israel today, you'll find up to 50,000 Karaite Jews, primarily living in the city of Ashdod along the Mediterranean coastline just south of Tel Aviv. In our next section, we'll be talking about the Karaite Jews of Egypt. This is a very important section, and this will be our good segue to bring this part 2 to a conclusion. Thank you for your attention. Consider this material as a documentary, as a lecture per se. It may be kind of dry, but if I did not read and research this material, you would probably never even check out the book, and would probably buy the book, and I will quote the book. You can look it up, you can buy it on Amazon and Google and other places like this in the description of this video. Again, this is part 2, bringing conclusion of an introduction to the Karaite people. I look forward to future documentary discussions on this fascinating subject about who and what are Karaite Jews. Please share the knowledge of wealth and love and truth to everyone who is willing to hear it. If they are resistant to your truth, well, show them it comes from the Torah. Don't shoot the messenger. Live that witness. Do not be a hypocrite, and they'll come running to you. Consider Zechariah 8:23 for that. And also remember, Rabbi ben-Emmett, I shoot from the hip quite often. I point out the white elephant in the room. I am the inconvenient truth. I'm a lighthouse on a hill where not be hid. I'm not politically correct, and I will always bring into account inconsistencies both in, say, Karaite Judaism and Rabbinical Judaism, and show what the differences are, and ultimately let you decide what your opinion may be moving forward. God bless you. Reb ben-Emmett signing out for another exciting edition of Torah Watchman Show. Please subscribe and personal notify.